Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Stanley Wu, and I'm the Omega Program Director and Director of the Resilience Project. This webinar is hosted by the Omega Collaborative, a consortium that is working on the global polycrisis that includes the Millennium Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere at Stanford, the Kranz Foresight Analysis Nexus, or the FAN Initiative, the Resilience Project, and the New School at Commonweal. We're delighted to be joined by Alnoor, Ladha, and Lynn Murphy in conversation with Michael Lerner to discuss their new book, Post Capitalism Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse. This book takes us on a journey from the history of wealth accumulation to the current logic of late-stage capitalism and to the lived possibilities of another way of knowing, sensing, and being that can usher in life-centric models. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation or conversation, please type them into the chat to both panelists and attendees, and we'll get to as many questions as we are able to. Also, please note that this conversation will be recorded and posted on the Omega website. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael Lerner.
Thank you, Stanley. And Alnoor, Ladha, and Lynn Murphy, welcome. We're so really thrilled and delighted to have you here. I won't spend time on your bios. We've put up a short version on the site, but suffice it to say that both of you, through a series of incarnations, both in and connected to philanthropy, but also transformatively outside philanthropy, have made truly major contributions to global healing, global justice, the search for a new way of being human on Earth. And your book, Post Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse, with a foreword by Vandana Shiva, in all my years of reading in the philanthropic literature, this is truly a unique resource. Nobody's done anything even remotely like this. It's brilliantly, I'm going to lift it up so people can see it. It's actually, part of the beauty of it is that it's brilliantly produced, and there are quotes on the front and the back from the former Eve Ensler, author of the Vagina Monologue. She says, post-capitalist philanthropy is an essential mystical revolutionary handbook that should be required reading for anyone involved in philanthropy. And there are like quotes on the back from a series of extraordinary people who you don't normally see blurbing philanthropy books. So we're in a evolutionary, revolutionary space with you, the two of you. And so we're so honored and delighted to have you. You're going to make a presentation for half the time, and then we'll have conversation and respond to questions in the chat. So Lynn and Alnoor, over to you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Stanley. Thanks, Omega, for having us. And thank you for sparing our bios so we don't have to be embarrassed by small S self identities and all the trappings of attribution.
With that, I wanted to open our time today, as we do in the book, with just a prayer, and I'll read the prayer as we have it here. May this text, may this time we have together today serve the healing of all beings, including the fallen deity of money and its offspring, the shadow alibi philanthropy. May the colonized mind and body be liberated, including our own. And today, the word presentation sounds a little bit formal. I think where our intention is to really offer up some lines of inquiry to explore this notion of post-capitalist philanthropy. And how do we find ourselves to be ever more contextually relevant in these times? I think those who are sitting in the same state as Commonweal last week with the closure of Silicon Valley Bank, this week with all the weather patterns, we recognize there are winds of change that are blowing. And so we really are sitting with this inquiry of how do we continue to do our inner work that we can see what the outer requirements are for us to be ever more contextually relevant, with greater humility, with greater trust, with greater embracing of not knowing, which doesn't necessarily preclude us from any sort of action. So that's the inquiry we're inviting us all in to be with today. And some of what we offer may be uncomfortable. You may feel constriction in your body or tension, or you may feel numb. You may shut down from listening to us. You may feel excitement. We welcome all of that. Sitting in the discomfort is part of how we learn and how we stretch and how we find our ways into this liberated body mind. Our praxis for change. And so we're asking one question just to sit with as you listen. Just for each of us to sit with, what am I still holding on to? Like, what is it that I'm still holding on to that may not serve? So we'll just sit with that question as we listen. And with that, Alnoor will start to tell us why philanthropy, what we're invoking around post-capitalism, and perhaps some of the paradoxes we embrace.
Yeah, and maybe just the continuation of the prompt is to stay with the trouble, to stay with the discomfort and not rush to solutionism. You know, the Occidental mind, the Western mind is trained in solutionism. And part of the request is to just sit with the trouble and track your somatic experience, be in the embodied cognition of it. And you can write down where in your body you're feeling constriction, what thought form, what words, what memes might trigger that. And we can also share that in the exchange at the end. So maybe to start with why philanthropy, I certainly had no intention of writing a book on philanthropy or spending much time in philanthropy. I was an activist, organizer, strategist for the last 20 plus years. And my experience of philanthropy was very rarely a good one, as you can imagine, funding for anti-capitalist and post-capitalist causes and working with social movements, mostly in the global South. And what we came to realize is that philanthropy is the upstream. Almost all social movements, unless they're volunteer-only social movements, are being funded by big philanthropy. Civil society, NGOs, not-for-profits, the whole complex is being funded more and more by philanthropy as we move and have been moving into a deeper and deeper neoliberal state over the last 50 years, where the state plays a smaller and smaller role in civil society, and its role becomes to protect capital and to promote corporate interests. And so we have a state-corporate nexus on the one side, and we have a philanthropic NGO industrial complex on the other. And the two are related, and the two feed each other. And philanthropy, just in grant making, this is not endowment. In the last year of data we have, which I think is 2018 or 19, was about $2.2 trillion. So it's the size of Canada's GDP, you know, a G7 country's GDP. And it's the most occluded, untransparent sector that we have, because of 501c3 tax law in the US and the exportation of the US philanthropic paradigm across the world. And so we have this very secretive sector that is used to launder money, both physically and morally, and impose the will of 1%ers into civil society. And at the same time, a lot of chest beating and triumphant attribution and acknowledgement of the work. And so one of the sort of questions and inquiries we sit with is, what if part of the crisis is the way philanthropy is responding to the crisis? More hierarchy, more doling out change, more control, the perpetuation of victim, perpetrator, savior, drama cycles, etc. And most people in philanthropy like to believe that they are on the good side of the equation of progress. And we're sitting with, what if our calculus is wrong? And what if progress is not an arrow moving ever upwards to some benevolent future of ascension, or whatever the New Age trope is? And that maybe time is more cyclical. And scientists may call this period the Anthropocene. In the Vedic tradition, We are in the Kali Yuga, within the Yuga cycles, we're in the Dark Ages. The Buddhists would call this the age of degeneration. The Hopi would say this is the time of the sixth sun. The Iroquois would say this is the time of the seventh fire, where we have to choose continued human destruction of the biosphere or some other choice, some other way of knowing, being, relating, sensing with the world. That is not just simply about solutionism, but shifting the very ontology. Ontology being onto from the Greek word being, sometimes seen as vision. And so the manner by which we approach is more important than what we think we're approaching, because even what we think we're approaching and what we think we know is determined by ontology. So ontology determines structure, and then structure determines ontology. And the two are discursive, self-reflexive, etc. And so we invoke this idea of post-capitalist philanthropy as a paradox. And of course, philanthropy and capitalism itself are in competition and feed each other. A few people have amassed so much wealth that they're determining the agenda of philanthropy. It's an externalization, as economists would say. And then this concentration of wealth, where does post-capitalism come into it? And part of our argument is that let's use capital in the short period of time where capital is useful, 10 years, 15 years, it's a self-terminating logic. It's going to implode on itself. You cannot have perpetual growth on a finite planet. And so then the question becomes, how do we use this capital in this short period of time where it's useful to build post-capitalist infrastructure? Land sovereignty, food sovereignty, water, energy, medicine, educational sovereignty at a bioregional level. And so there's resilience before these impending cascading collapses deepen and deepen and deepen. And of course, many people in the world have been living in these collapses since at least the time of colonialism and the conquistadors. Certain people's worlds ended, and very soon, all of our worlds are going to end in the way we see them. And it's very hard for the human mind where we're evolutionarily and cognitively impaired, right? We have this temporal myopia where it's difficult for us to see beyond a certain event horizon. We think what happened yesterday is a determiner of what will happen tomorrow. And we know discontinuous change and collapse of civilizations has something else in store for us. And so how do we embrace what's coming? How do we stay in a non-dualistic approach, not collapsing onto hope or collapsing into fear and despair, as they're both functionally equivalent? We'll start with a couple of slides just to orient the conversation.
And maybe while Alnoor is doing that, just to say that, as Alnoor was suggesting, the way that we're invoking post-capitalism is not an old versus new. It's not rooted so much in temporality. It's much more that we're trying to see what comes that is actually informed by capitalism. And for us, we're sitting with a set of like a pluralistic container of values of what post-capitalism could look like that can include kinship, solidarity, empathy, cooperation, nonviolence, altruism, a whole other background condition, if you will, that also lives innerly in memetics around us and innerly. That is a way that when we invoke post-capitalist realities, it's these ways of being that point us in other directions. So we're not pointing so much to the old versus new. And this is the inquiry we're sitting with. And Alnoor is going to then kind of move us into, well, what is the background condition? What is the memetic structure that we're currently operating in?
So people often ask us, well, okay, if we agree with your analysis, what should we do next? And part of what we say is, well, what are you doing now? What values are you living in now? As Lynn says, post-capitalism is not another ism to come after the existing neoliberal paradigm. It's a set of values that requires looking at the existing set of arrangements and then deciding consciously to be in let's say, a conscientious objector to the life-destroying ways that articulate our current economic operating system. and to move to something else. So many of you will already know this and perhaps agree with the analysis, but it's worth just saying that the neoliberal operating system is the top of the pyramid within pyramid logic. And so what that means is that we think we're free from the existing paradigm. And many people will say, well, you know, I am an anti-capitalist or I denounce neoliberalism, and yet neoliberalism is more than political economy. It's sociocultural, it's mimetic. By mimetic, we mean, you know, memes as the cultural base units of genes, as viral intellectual cognitive diseases that are communicable, they're transferable from one person to another. So whether we like it or not, we all have an invisible hand that lives within us. We've all been socialized and trained, conditioned to believe that if we pursue our selfish interests, that somehow a perfect equilibrium is going to be created. The God hand of the market will provide. And it lives in our bodies. These thought forms take mimetic real estate. They are in the socio-cultural political milieu, in the media, in textbooks, in novels, in cultural artifacts of all kinds. And so that's the top of the pyramid. And we'll talk a little bit more when we get into what ontological shifts we are seeing and want to amplify, where we'll get into like clear distinction about what's happening now in this continuum. So that's the top of the pyramid. And then we come underneath the pyramid and we say, well, if that's the pervasive, totalizing oxygen that we're all breathing, of course, every sector is going to be serving that operating system. And there's really no way out within the current paradigm. So people will say, well, cryptocurrency is going to change the face of money systems or monetary systems or what have you. And what we would say is the role of crypto is to diversify the portfolio of debt-based capital. Bitcoin's value is determined by its equivalency in USD. It's not a revolution, it's diversification of capital's desire to self-perpetuate and continue on in perpetuity. Same with science and technology, right? That somehow this techno-utopian dream of humans are have this industriousness and we have this ingenuity that's going to get us out of it. But, well, who's determining the research priorities of science and technology? Where's the funding coming from? What's the socioeconomic class of the people making these decisions, right? Largely white males who have gone to Ivy League schools and don't have a relationship with the mother and you know, give their power to some father figure, Silicon Valley venture capital person like Peter Thiel or whatever, right? And so the replication, we see it in every industry over and over and over. And it's definitely true in philanthropy. The role of the sector has always been to launder the conscience of 1%ers and robber barons. And the entire 501c3 tax structure, which incentivizes large endowments giving some trickle-down amount and then receiving commensurate tax breaks, is part of the neoliberal operating system. And of course, we can say, well, neoliberalism has only been around for 50 years. There's been this 5,000-year separation from nature, from city-states and proto-capitalism and industrial capitalism. And what we'd say is, yes, capitalist modernity has been the overall operating structure, but neoliberalism is the latest and most pernicious and nefarious chapter of the 5,000-year march towards abstract thought, towards hierarchy, patriarchy, white supremacy, extraction, destruction of the living world, separation, human anthropocentric supremacy, etc. And so that's baked into philanthropy. And then the institutions within all of these sectors, including philanthropy, think that they have all this leeway. Lynn and I, a couple of years ago, met a kind of nouveau riche billionaire who made his money from Silicon Valley, who has very similar values to many of the people on this call, and was very excited about what he could do with his $4 billion or whatever, was going to give it all away. And we saw him, I don't know, 18 months later, and he was completely deflated. Operating within the 501c3 structure, he had to have a very limited remit on what his foundation could do within certain tax laws. He had his accountants and lawyers and investment bankers and hedge fund managers all telling him he must grow his capital pool. And he went from this very ambitious, I'm going to give all my money away, to maybe I push the 5% and give away 6% or 7%, while he's making 20% in hedge funds that are invested in fossil fuels. And so even the most radical progressive people and institutions within this structure replicate the structure because we are enmeshed in this pyramid logic. And then the same goes for individuals. It doesn't matter how radical or free thinking we are, the mystics among us, the alchemists among us, the assassins among us, even within these organizations, the best they can do is reform or slightly less harm than their counterparts who are, whatever, at Ford Foundation and OSF and Gates and imposing neoliberal, neocolonial development across the world. And so that's the essence of pyramid logic.
So as we sat with all of this and recognizing all of our complicity within this, whether you sit within a philanthropic organization, whether you're an individual working as an NGO, whether you're a person who manages your household within the nuclear family structure, we were recognizing just how caught we are. And as we listened and did the research for this book, we recognize, not just by those we spoke with, but what we see, that there is a lot of effort that's going on in the world to acknowledge the need to use the words decolonize, to reckon with power and to reckon with this legacy of the Occidental mind, the very gaze by which we operate, to recognize how the NGO structure and all these institutions are set up still to perpetuate and to glorify the geopolitical north in a lot of ways, that power and decisions are often made by people sitting within the geopolitical north, even if they're serving places among the world's global majority. And we recognize there's a growing set of people and movements and institutions that are responding to this, whether it be through efforts to decolonize philanthropy, to work on what we are calling the just transition, through seeing we need to move away from systems of domination and exploitation to ones that start to transition us off of, whether it be fossil fuels, a small cadre of people making the majority of decisions, that being primarily not necessarily people of culture, people, white-bodied people often making a lot of those decisions. So we acknowledge this, and we were looking at this movement of what we would call the just transition through this Three Horizons framework that Bill Sharp offers us. And as we actually sat with it and looked at it, we recognize that sometimes the language, the content is on Horizon 2, acknowledging the meta crisis or the poly crisis or the need to get monies in the hands of communities themselves. But still the tactics and the approach is often in Horizon 1. So efforts to look at the Green New Deal are still within an extractive system. It's, instead of going after fossil fuels, perhaps lithium. And obviously there's ones that are more obvious, but when you really get into it, you recognize that governance, that tactics are still kind of reformist agenda in their nature. And they're still rooted in an ontological gaze, the very way that we perceive reality, that is materialistic, that is separatist, that still has airs of competition more than kinship and finding right relationship. So we sat with like, well, why is it that we're seeing so little around this Horizon 2? And the bottom of this Three Horizons that you see is looking at the dominant logic, the pyramid logic, and recognizing that to actually truly move into this Horizon 2, what Alnoor and I will talk about as transition pathways, there's something about the very gaze. There's something about our ontology, the way that we see the world and why we see the world the way that we do, and the way that we see knowledge, and the way that we see ourselves in relationship with one another. This very basic inner structures has to start to change. And so what we started calling for is something called just transition plus onto shifts. And we borrowed that word onto shifts from the work of David Beaulieu around the commons that was looking at what is it, and it's onto shifts with an S. And just before Alnoor goes into what that is, in the book, we have a number of different pieces of art in there that we asked a couple of artists to just read it and offer images of what they felt came through the text. And this was one by Federico Cruz, who's a dear beloved brother and ally in Mexico, who is pointing to this just transition plus onto shifts by this picture. You can't solve money problems with money. So this is what we're trying to get to, some of these root systems and how they manifest within us and our institutions and our approaches and the way that we approach the sector.
And that's a well-known Zapatista line, for those of you who know, and Fede grew up in the Zapatista household in Morales, Mexico. So what do we mean by ontological shifts? I said a little bit at the beginning about this, but it bears saying again that ontology is the manner by which we approach, see, relate, dissect, and interact with the world. In philosophy, it often sits between epistemology and metaphysics. So epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge. Why do we know what we know or think we know what we know? And metaphysics is, why do we think we're here? And what ontology says is, well, you don't even know what you know absent of ontology. And you cannot contemplate metaphysics, the broader picture of why we're here, until you have deepened your analysis and contemplated your own ontology. The quantum physicist and philosopher Karen Barad often talks about ethico-onto-epistemology, that our ethics and how we behave in the world is not separate to how we see the world, is not separate to how we think we understand the world, that this is one paradigm. And academia's desire to split these fields that are so inherent, just like politics and economics and morality can't be split, our ontology cannot be split from other philosophical inquiries. And so part of the question we ask is, how do we move from this dominant pyramid logic to more emergent, relational, animistic, queer ontologies that trouble our very notions that we've inherited from 500 years of colonialism, so-called Enlightenment logic, scientism, and industrialism. And so I'm just going to share a couple of these. The book goes into detail on all of these, but we'll just pick a couple. So we'll take the fourth one, for example. The source code of capitalist modernity is based on separation, materialism, and positivism. And what this means is that we are taught through, initially through the dualist notion that humans are separate from the natural world. And part of the Enlightenment dualism was that men are separate from women, that white Christian men are on top of this pyramid, and everyone else is other. And this was the justification for colonialism and genocide in the so-called New World. And that separation has a very deep anthropocentric exceptionalism at its core. And it also suggests that because we are separate, and through our rational mind, we can then reduce the material world to its constituent parts. So the table that this laptop is sitting on can be reduced to its atoms, and its atoms to its neutrons and its protons and its electrons, and now with quantum physics to its quanta or photons or qualia or what have you. And that not only can we understand the mystery of the living world, we are entitled to understand the living world in this way. and that the role of science, its eventual goal, will be to find this grand unifying theory of everything, which is the holy grail of all science, but especially the natural sciences and physics. And then we say, well, okay, what is an antidote logic in this continuum? And one way to see it is to start to embrace more non-dualistic approaches, to say we're not dismissing science, but science is the floor of understanding as opposed to the ceiling. 200 years ago, we believed that the Earth was less than 1 billion years old, and now we know it's 4.4 billion, we know, and that it's a continual basic shared understanding of fact using a very particular type of circular axiomatic logic, and that's useful, but that's not the end of the story. And that we can hold that and also hold mystery, which is not a problem to be solved by the rational mind. And how do we move from a materialist worldview to an animistic worldview, where the universe is alive, the cosmos is alive, the Earth is alive, which we know even from, science is the younger brother of common sense, and mysticism is catching up with through Earth system science, through deep ecology, etc. That the world is a living system. We are constituent parts within that living system. And how do we move to a more queer worldview from this kind of heteronormative monoculture of mind to many ways of knowing, being, sensing, and relating to the world? And moving from rationalism to relationalism, where we are in relationality. And so this table, another way to view this table that the laptop is sitting on, is this wooden table is kin that I'm in deep relationship with. It has sacrificed its life to be in relationship in this way. It has its own agency, its own will, its own entelechy. And I'm not entitled to do with it what I want outside of consent and dialogue. That would be a more indigenous, mystical, Sufi Taoist worldview. And we're not saying these onto shifts are just like a key turn. They require practice. They require staying with the trouble. They require being in contemplation and sitting with the complexity and ambiguity and the chaos that we find ourselves in, and 5,000 years of consequence. And so what does it mean to be alive in the age of consequence, in the Kali Yuga, in the Anthropocene? So then I'll just pick one more, maybe the third from the bottom, entitlement to entrustment. There's a Sufi proverb, often attributed to the great mother speaking to her children. And she says, "You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing. You've been entrusted with the bounty of life, with oxygen, with your epigenetic, genetic patrimony and matrimony, your cultural inheritance, your endowments, and these are not entitlements. Entrustment requires responsibility. It requires taking on the consequence and bearing the consequence of your behaviors and actions. It requires an understanding of karma and the karmic spiritual implications, for example, of being a money hoarder at the end of time." This is just a piece of art from the book by a dear sister named Elixa Garcia, who's an Afro-Colombian artist based in the US.
Maybe as Alnoor is moving to the next slide, just to say that this piece that we're invoking again with justice plus onto shifts, there's a line that came to us through a dear brother, Bayo Akomolafe, who said that the calls for social justice will get us a seat at the table, but will never allow us to leave the house of modernity. So we're acknowledging this need for what it is to come back in right relationship, what it is to work in the space of whether you want to use the word reconciliation, reparations, but to do this work and to acknowledge the harm that has been done. But we have to actually invoke the very deepest shift of our gaze in the manner by which we approach to actually start to get out of the house of modernity.
So I'm going to just do this slide very quickly. The whole third part of the book is dedicated to this slide, so we're not going to do it justice here. we're just pointing towards potential pathways out of the colonized mind of pyramid logic. And what the slide is indicating is that at the core of that, at the center, is cosmology. That we have abdicated our responsibility for being in inquiry around first principles. Why are we here? Where are we going? What is our purpose as human beings, as kin in relationship to the living world and the living cosmos? We've abdicated that responsibility to institutional religions, to the media, to corporations, to governments, to a culture of hero worship, where other people answer these questions for us. And in any culture worthy of the name culture, people would go into deep inquiry. They would go through initiations at very young ages in order to have deathless deaths, to ponder these questions, to come back and be of service to the community and the broader congress of life. And that even in the Western tradition, for example, Greek culture was based on having these inquiries in first principles as ongoing political, spiritual praxis. And that the Roman merger with Christianity and capitalism and the destruction of paganism in Europe sort of ended that culture of inquiry. And so that becomes central. And then as we spiral out, and this is not a one-time thing, right? What we say at the bottom is for all of these within the spiral, that these are multi-directional, they're reflexive, they're discursive, they feed each other, they're nonlinear, and they're interconnected. And so how we see the world and how we show up in the world at that moment changes as the way we see the world changes, as how we show up in the world changes. And one does not go before the other. Meditating in a cave for 10 years may or may not help you do that work. This kind of new age trope of do the inner work first belies the fact that our context is not asking for such, that something else is being asked of us, that inner work and outer work are simultaneously mirroring each other and are necessary self-reinforcing aspects of each other. And so as we move out, we go into rethinking the individual as webs of relational entanglements. So this kind of Occidental Eurocentric notion of the human as individual and the individual as the locus of control has to give way for even what science is now understanding is that we are holobionts. We have evolved through symbiogenesis, as Lynn Margulis would say. That even the bacteria in our body that is 90% of our cells and our biome are sort of determining the quality of our thoughts, that we are who we are through others, as people of the Ubuntu culture would say, of Africa. And that these webs of relational entanglements are embedded within broader social ecologies. And what we call communities or institutions or movements or cultures or nation states are actually also holobionts in a fractal way. They are social ecologies. My dog agrees. His name is Dunya, which means world within worlds. So he's reinforcing the fractal nature of this. And then these social ecologies are embedded into sectors that we could call biomes. And there is no philanthropic sector, there is no media sector, there's no government sector. These are biomes that's purpose should be to unite social ecologies rather than doing their own bidding. And that these biomes then feed into a broader superstructure, which we could think of as, instead of an operating system, which is an old model, right? This is not going to be about Marx and Engels and a couple of smart white Europeans cracking the next ism, but more of a mycelial service and superstructure as this kind of mycelial web that is interrelated and has a purpose. And that purpose can only come from initiated adults who have understood the depths of cosmology and ontology. And that, of course, that these superstructures, these mycelial service structures, are embedded in the broader planetary ecology, what we call the Gaian entelechy. And entelechy is a Greek word that says en is in, and lechi is telechi is purpose. So it's like it has its own purpose, its own agency, its own will within itself. That Gaia knows what she's doing. That our role is not to impose our will, but perhaps rather than spending 3 years in a strategy process, putting our head down to the soil and asking for guidance, permission, consent is maybe a more sophisticated strategy. That taking 5 grams of mushrooms in a dark room or sitting in an ayahuasca ceremony or listening to the whispers of your ancestors is as valuable as any rationalist exercise in figuring out the acupuncture points of neoliberal capitalism.
So as Alnoor was speaking with the spiral logic, our intention there is not to try to replace one hegemonic view with another, but rather to invoke the fractal infinite possibilities in the journey in inner and outer interconnectedness to find our way. And as Alnoor and I were listening for, what could be done now in the philanthropic sector if it takes itself as a biome, connecting social ecology as a web of relationships that's really grappling these notions of cosmology with the humility to recognize there's a call and response from the earth and from the cosmos herself. We came to what we call the 5 elements mandala. And we use the frame of a mandala because it's a healing journey, and it's one that goes in and goes out at the same time. And so what I'm going to offer here is our subjective view of what could be called these transition pathways, moving us towards systems that honor life, towards what the unknown of what post-capitalist realities might eventually look like, feel like, taste like in our world. So this mandala begins with, as this slide shows, there's 2 axes, and the horizontal axis looks at what is it within ourselves to do the work to be in solidarity. So that's invoking the ongoing inner praxis, not the self-identified allyship, but this ongoing inner work to actually live in solidarity. And in this case, the element of water is on the left. And what is it to live in solidarity with Indigenous peoples? So if philanthropy says, okay, I'm going to take some of my endowment funding and I'm going to grant it towards these Indigenous peoples with the land that they are stewarding, and I'm going to ask them to give me reports, and I'm going to check in every couple of years. This is not the quality of solidarity that we're invoking. This is actually acknowledging that there's peoples who've already been living these post-capitalist realities for a very long time, who have a lot of knowledge and ways of being and tending waters and lands and forests, especially where the biodiversity is around the world. And what is it to shift the ontological gaze, to live in right relationship with the stewards of those places and those peoples? It means that as people look at, for example, fire ecology in the state of California, where I used to live, it means not just taking traditional ecological knowledge to put it into the very metrics that we're all looking at to see how we can continue to use our occidental gaze and that deep knowledge, that deep epistemology and way of being to justify how we're trying to now solve the very problem we created. It's a more humble way of practicing what is solidarity with this other piece of what is restoration of right relationship and kinship. And so the other side of that axis is the element of fire. And here we're really invoking a lot of the social movements and solidarity with those social movements, especially among the world's majority, those who are often in the places where lands are still being stolen or taken, or people are being pushed off, or the myriad issues that we know that there are many movements around the world that are already trying to not just stand up in an us and them, but resist, but their very way of being, their way of resacralizing life itself is itself a social movement. And how do we do the deep work to come into right relationship and restore what has been lost and an ongoing practice of solidarity? So that's this piece of it. And then that assumes that there's preparation for an actual alchemical state change, which is our other axis, this axis of transform and create. And at the top of that is the element of air. And here we're invoking the creation of new, ancient, emerging cultural contexts. Many of us have heard the cliche for many, many years that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So why is that we're so caught in systems of destruction that we actually have a real dearth of the collective imaginary of what are life-centric systems? So this is work that looks at memetics and narratives and listens to the artists and asks them to really do the deep work to show us what some of these new, ancient, emerging cultural contexts can be that value and that recenter life. And at the bottom of this is the earth herself, the element of earth. And this is what we call creating post-capitalist infrastructure. And this looks at where bioregional sovereignty for food, for water, for health, for education, for cultural sovereignty. This is where you can imagine a lot of working on asset management within and everything that needs to happen in this material form that is a shift of power, and that is much more, it's working with this notion of kinship and restoration in this transformation itself. And I'm invoking the notion of alchemy and transform because it assumes a state change. And so we're showing this as transition pathways that is also invoking what Alnoor was just laying out, these onto shifts in all the ways that we approach this. So this whole mandala revolves around the center, which is the element of ether. And for ether, for us, this is acknowledging that we have a misunderstanding at best, all the way to a very deep broken relationship with life force herself. And so this is the work of trauma, and not to work on trauma to have better adjusted people in modernity, not to transactionalize these wounds, but to actually humble ourselves to say, what is it that we've been pouring cement, literally and figuratively, all over the earth, and we're in a really broken relationship with life force. So what is all this work, this reparative, restorative, healing work that all of these other elements of the mandala are in relationship with, to find ourselves in transition pathways that are honoring life within ourselves, within our relations and our institutions. And we could go into perhaps in the discussion of what that might look like for various philanthropic organizations or the endowments or other pieces. But I just want to spend one moment in the way that we end the book, which is, this is our kind of going back and remixing this 3 horizons framework in a way. And sitting with and positing, what if where we are right now, rather than just trying to find our ways to reform capitalism or reform our economy, what if where we actually are is in a place where we need to very deeply surrender control? And that control may be to our certainty of knowing, our addiction to comfort, the ways that we have approached our work, the ways that we have approached the way that we see the problems of this world. And if we're in a deep inner and outer let go and surrender moment, and if we engage actively in that surrender, then it takes us to recognize that we as a species are in an initiatory moment, that there's this threshold if you go into initiation ceremonies, that you have to cozy up to death itself and cross the threshold. And that we're invoking that we can ourselves innerly and collectively actually traverse this threshold that we find ourselves in this meta crisis, in this poly crisis, in the Anthropocene. And if we can find our ways through that with humility and accept this species threshold moment, perhaps this is a way that we can find ourselves to walk each other into the unknown and to re-enter this continuum of life and death that ever has been and always shall be. So our offering is in this moment, this age of consequence, that we find ourselves to surrender, to cross the threshold, and to walk each other into the unknown. And maybe I'll see if Alnoor has anything
I
to
think
end
that's
with.
a good place to stop. We have some questions, and some recommendations that we could share a slide or two if the questions come up. We're just kind of, yeah, they're pre-thought, let's say, counter arguments for what should we do. And we don't want to go into solutionism. And if it comes, you know, we can also have that dialogue. But I think that's probably a good place to stop. So yeah, we've done like 45 minutes, and maybe we can have 35 minutes of questions or so and dialogue.
Thank you, Lynn and Alnoor. Extraordinary. I'd like to ask us as a transition just to go into a moment of quiet together and just allow ourselves to be with what we've heard. Peace, peace. This has been a most extraordinary presentation. As Lynn points out, presentation is the wrong word. It's what I'd say is most extraordinary teaching. It's a teaching. And I would like to invite all of you, first of all, please post questions, but more than posting questions, I'd be very curious if any of you have had somatic experiences being together today, that what's happened to you as you have not only listened to, but participated in this teaching. I will say for myself that it dropped me into far deeper places in myself than I usually am dropped into in electronic communications like this. And I'm just curious if any of the rest of you have had experiences, whether positive or negative, in that polarity that you'd like to share. Did it, as Lynn said, did it make you uncomfortable? Oh, a heart is floating up. Great. And more hearts can float up if you want. Did it make you uncomfortable? Did it remind you of things? Patton Stevens says, I had to let go of taking notes and listen, absorb, allow. Beautiful. Thank you, Patton. And others, let's just hear from you. What happened to you as we sat together experiencing deep teaching? What was your somatic experience? What happened to you? It took me deep. And I want to, as you do that, I want to read a line of one of many in this extraordinary book that goes like this. Part of the practice of resistance to dominant culture is to create and live alternatives of such beauty and extraordinariness that the so-called, quote, others, end quote, are magnetically drawn to post-capitalist possibilities. As part of this, we must enact spiritual political praxis with others in community and in dialogue to create embodied cultures of change and lived possibilities. And then there's a note after that. The word spiritual is loaded for many. We use it here to distinguish between the materialist Newtonian aspect of reality as the seen world and gesture toward a more quantum Borean aspect of unseen and unknowable as also real. But the line I loved was, part of the practice of resistance to dominant culture is to create and live alternatives of such beauty and extraordinariness that the so-called others are magnetically drawn to post-capitalist possibilities. And Alnoor and Lynn, you have chosen that, and there'll be people on this call who don't know where you are calling from and don't know about where you are living. So could you both speak for a moment to just the choices you have made to live lives of such beauty and extraordinariness that actually are magnetically drawing people to post-capitalist possibilities.
Yeah, there's this cheesy line by, I think, the lead singer of the Eagles. He said, I forgot what his name is now, but he said, call someplace paradise and kiss it goodbye.
Yes.
Right. And so we'll describe where we live, but we're not saying this is any utopia, right? It's just a practice, and it's
Right,
one.
sure.
And so we are in the northwest jungle of Costa Rica, on a land project called Tierra Valiente, Brave Earth in English. It's 88-acre organic regenerative biodynamic farm. 23 of us came together and bought the land and put it into a trust, so nobody owns it. Nobody can speculate on the land or its increase in value. We call it a post-capitalist experiment. Part of the reason is, we say, it's the Kali Yuga. So the one thing you shouldn't speculate on, which is Pachamama herself, is the one, guaranteed investment, right? Real estate always increases in value. And so we basically removed ourselves from that ability to do so. Everyone here is either an activist, an artist, or a healer. No one has a lot of funds, so the small amount of money we put in to collectively buy this land was most people's life savings or borrowed money, and they'll never see that money back. And that's part of the gift of what it is to be land stewards. We have a healing center here. We call it the Center for Applied Cultural Transition. And we run it as a not-for-profit cooperative with no distinction between capital and labor. So whether you put in money or you're a full-time local Costa Rican working here, you get the equal dividends. So that's kind of, part of our work and where we live. And we're not doing it to make some big show of what we're doing. We want to live our values, right? Like Lynn was living in California. I was living in London, and then New York, and then South Africa, and always in quite urban environments, and paying thousands of dollars of rent, or paying mortgages in a house you don't own, and working in jobs you don't like doesn't seem like an interesting strategy at this point in history. And so we just reduce our cost of living by growing our own food and living in community in this way, and we're less capturable. If you want a Wikipedia page and a big job title at Google and whatever the dominant culture is serving on tap, you are susceptible to being co-opted and manipulated and seduced. And so we're not saying we're not capable of those things, but we're trying to minimize the ability for the dominant culture to elevate us within the deathways. And I love this Walt Whitman line where he says, the good news is I'm the best of them, and the bad news is I'm the worst of them. We're capable of anything. And so context determines behavior. And so we're just trying to create a context in which we are in slightly better etiquette, let's say.
And Lynn, you made the transition from being a full-on philanthropoid and a very significant foundation with a bright future. And one of your early way stations was to spend time at Commonweal, and now you're down in Costa Rica. What? What's
We have
that?
a dog barking. So yeah, okay, now he's quieted.
But in any case, what has this transition, this lived transition been for you from somebody who was a very promising career in large-scale philanthropy, coming to Commonwealth for a while, finding your way down to Costa Rica? How has this lived transformation been for you?
Wow, thank you, Michael, for the question, and just honoring the relational lines and the land that Commonweal and being in the garden at the time that I was, and my relationship. I'll start with, I got increasingly uncomfortable with being a woman who in this lifetime incarnated as a white woman sitting at the time at the Hewlett Foundation in Menlo Park, making decisions about what was happening for people's lives in countries in the geopolitical South. And the contradiction that I felt in philanthropy with the 5% and the endowment and the investment. And so I had to, it was kind of one of those like soul and heart things that told me no matter what, you got to resign. And can be terrifying because you're let going of vocation, livelihood, identity, place where I was of service. And on the one hand, I completely fell apart. Some of you who know me over the years know that I would get up and down. And this was a process of inner undoing. And if I really take it into where my spiritual with the political praxis is, it was a way in which my ego's attachment to importance had to get just kind of cut at every level, including any sense of attachment to the importance of work that's in the energy of ambition or of getting it right. And so this is where you'll hear Alnoor and I again and again try to sit with that we have to do this inner work within ourselves in an ongoing way, continually. So it was that, as well as I kind of often will say that I no longer wanted to live in a world that was determined by the writings of Adam Smith or Karl Marx. I was looking for other ways of knowing and being. And that took me to commonweal, to permaculture, to somatics, to ecology, to eventually meeting Alnoor and knowing that we had something to do together. And I quite honestly resisted coming to Costa Rica at first. I lived here in the 90s, and being again a woman from the global north who's worked around this planet, I was really sitting with the ethics of what was it to come here in this time and how to do this in a good way. What Alnoor didn't say about the project here is there's both the stewardship of the land, there's this, as he said, the Center for Applied Cultural Transition, which means we're all in the active lived praxis of how do we walk off the neoliberal structures within ourselves, within our relationships, within the place that we live as well here in this community called San Juan. So we're working with a mutual aid network, and how do we be in right relationship with the peoples who've been stewarding these lands, the ancestors, the Malaku, who were here well before, and those who've been stewarding these lands for the last decades. And maybe the last thing to say on a personal note of how I have found my way here is continue to listen. And these days, that also means spending part of my time in another part of the country, mostly in solitude, communing with the mountain and the river. So I'm not anthropomorphizing, but more, I keep getting to be more and more in solitude to then find what's really mine to do.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on some of the comments, beautiful comments in the chat. I'm going to read them. Alicia Whitnick, in response, as someone who feels deeply spiritual and connected to the universe in my personal life, it is absolutely transformative to hear this language and teaching applied to the world of philanthropy, the immense challenges and how we rethink and reimagine how we approach everything we do. Thank you so much for your brilliance and your bravery in sharing this reorientation and questioning. And then Jim Quay, I'm so grateful, Jim, because we need to hear from all the sides, and we're really interesting. The vocabulary was new, as was the ontology it attempts to express. I experienced confusion, challenge, and curiosity. That's a lovely response. Then from our beloved friend Preeta, who's done so much in this work, as I'm sure some of you know, I become aware of the dead places in my body. I am reminded of Howard Thurman's quote, "It feels like my main work is to continue to become alive rather than to stay in my head." They just jumped here. And that seems like an experiential somatic exercise. Putting these beautiful truths into words can be an empowering exercise of naming, adding head for those already deep into the path. For the vast majority who are not largely alive already and who live in the deadened world of our systems, words, even these beautiful words, can feel like, quote, fighting words and be received in a heady way. I wonder how this can be packaged in a head, heart, hands way that is invitational and digestible for those who are deeply enmeshed in the world as it is, meeting people wherever they are and inviting them to come alive. And Akil Bell wrote, greetings all. How do we envision and imagine the integration of Black people, descendant of slaves, and Pan-African people who were some of the first commodities and systematically excluded from these knowledges, practices, and conversations, even when the capacities exist to contribute fully to these conversations and engagements, policies and procedures pop up to exclude and reject. So those are some beautiful reflections, and I welcome your reflections on them.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with James. To say, yeah, Alhamdulillah, Mazel Tov. I celebrate the confusion and the challenge and the curiosity. And we are not entitled to not feel those things. And that, we know from adult learning that discomfort is where we grow. Those sort of edge spaces is where we grow. And part of what we are trying to do in the book is to create new vocabulary. And post-capitalism requires us to rethink our language from the kind of dead, inert, inanimate, binary language of English to a more animistic, relational ways of knowing, being, sensing, and speaking about the world. And I don't know if we're even good at it or not, or the contribution is useful, but that was our attempt. And our attempt is not to persuade people as well, right? Like, that's not the aim of this. Like, this is not a book for everybody, and nor should it be. Like, our aim is not to be New York Times bestseller or have this book at the airport. It's for those, with the ears to hear, as Christians would say. And yeah, this distinction between head, hands, and heart, I personally don't subscribe to. And I know Lynn and I have different perspectives on that. I feel like speaking about these things it sort of comes later. It comes after years of practice and embodiment. And I'm still resistant to speak about them. I didn't want to write this book. I personally don't want to engage with philanthropy. And I had shifts along the way. I went from being an activist who had to raise funds with a lot of disdain towards philanthropy. And then that sort of moved to sympathy when I realized how disturbed their lives are, especially like the billionaires that we would engage with. Byzantine courts around them, everybody wanting something, ungrateful children, internal battles in the family over money, having to call their lawyers and their accountants and their hedge fund managers 3 times a day, being in the reptilian mind 90% of the time. And then that moved to empathy. And only when it moved to empathy and solidarity could I be in relationship with funders. And Lynn and I kind of made a vow to each other and to the Transition Resource Circle and the people we engage with that we'll never pitch anyone on funding for any of our projects. That it would just come from relationship if they were interested, not as funders, and we would not be grantees, but if we were going to be in constellation together and kinship together, that would just naturally emerge and we would know what our work was to do, and that would happen in dialogue and conversation and consent. People have offered us money and we've said no because those conditions didn't exist. And also maybe just the last thing to say is that for me, part of the work of neuroplasticity and working with plant medicine is that there is no distinction between head, hands, and heart. Like, there is no distinction between ethics, ontology, and epistemology or cosmology. That when we speak, we feel what we speak. And we can only feel what we speak when we're living what we speak. And that these things are integrated. And for me personally, my role is not to create lowest common denominator communication for more and more people. to fully live, that's their obligation and responsibility as a citizen of troubled times. And of course, more can be done, and Lynn can talk a bit about that. And then the last thing on not just Black bodies, but also brown bodies, Indigenous bodies, all marginalized peoples, that that in many ways we have an advantage through trauma. That Bayo Akomolafe did a beautiful 4-day session on trauma for science and non-duality. And one of the frames that came out of that is trauma is not just a meteorite with its impact point. It's also the restructuring of the body and the soul and the heart and the mind that comes from that. So the traumas that our ancestors endured create more resilience in our bodies. And you know, my family were Arabs, indigenous, mystical, Sufi Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula who were forced to migrate to Egypt for 500 years. And then when the Crusades happened and Cairo was sacked, they moved to Persia for 700 years, usually in exile and persecution and hiding. And then they moved to East Africa. My mom's family was in Zanzibar for 10 generations. And came over as indentured slaves for the English railway and other English endeavors. And that I'm so grateful for their sacrifices and for their trauma. And growing up poor in the ghetto of East Vancouver, I have no victimhood or resent about it. My practice is to try to integrate trauma. And I see trauma as unintegrated resource. And that it gives me an advantage in being able to be part of these conversations. And actually the biggest risk is for me to try to compete in the dominant culture. You know, I don't think we need more inclusion in deathways. We don't need more Black, Indigenous, brown, or women CEOs or in boardrooms. We need to be death doulas for capitalist modernity. And we are better equipped to do that. You know, Indigenous peoples that have unbroken lines, symbiotic lines with the living world and place and plant are in a much better position for collapse and maybe the only people who survive. And I think we need to celebrate that. And this sort of new monotheism of trauma that is an excuse, an alibi for bad behavior, for me is just, it's not acceptable. And as Lynn said, you know, we don't want more well-adjusted cogs in capitalist machinery. We need more revolutionaries and dreamers and mystics and artists and healers and death doulas.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of pieces. I opened the book to this line that Taj James, the co-founder of Full Spectrum Capital, said to us when we were speaking with him, as kind of this push out towards justice plus ontological shifts. People are starting to see that capital is energy and that it needs to flow like water. Water moves to the lowest places in geography, the places that requires its flowing energy. Capital that is not flowing is simply the continuation of colonization. So I was hearing this last question of these various roles of what we were trying to invoke in this ongoing praxis of solidarity and the work of right relationship with kin and the reparative work that needs to happen. And I was invoking solidarity with social movements for the world's majority as an act of disruption of the way that we often call the marginalized, actually the world's majority. And we recognize that there was a very deep philosophical and historical project to dehumanize, especially those of Black and brown bodies, and thingify nature. And so when we're speaking to the shift of the spiral logic into the animism, into the way, it's not to jump over the work that's needed. This is why we invoke post-capitalism, to be informed by the conditions of capitalism, these, one could say, murderous, kind of stamping out life force itself and the consequences of that, of dehumanizing and thingifying everything and not seeing the sets of relationships that brought this table to us, that brought this computer to us with all of the minerals and the parts. What is it to actually work on restoring right relationships in that? And this piece that Alnoor and I are saying is there's a set, in our view, a set window that there's going to be a day the dollar dies. Some of us are starting to feel that. And so what is it to use capital in this moment to liberate capital? And we're offering a couple of coordinates that have come to us. But as Alnoor said, we're feeling like that we don't have the answers or the framework. It's far better for us to lay our forehead down on the earth and ask for the guidance and to see what it is that we're still holding on to, that we're afraid to kind of loosen the hand. And to Preetha's question,
I try to add it a little bit right here.
Yeah.
Do you want to read that? You want me to read that, Michael? I'm just going to
Yeah, go ahead, please do.
She says, thanks, that helps a lot for you to say that. The words came after years of embodiment. I get that. My suggestion was this, that starting with words can be a block, for sure. For some people, these words book will be the first exposure and who have not done the work of embodiment. So my question involves, how do we start with the invitation to embodiment, somatic aliveness, not having the invitation be just words?
Yeah.
I know you're doing that in other contexts.
Yeah, so I was going to say to Preetha's piece is that the project Alnoor and I co-guide, we call it a temporary organizational zone called Transition Resource Circle, is working. We do gatherings with funders or funder activists to actually all of ourselves to go into this inner and outer work, to work together in this spiritual political praxis, to work with embodied cognition and other ways of being and knowing. And my dear sister Preetha and I may end up developing a curriculum to do something like this online that we can just offer out for people. And when I sit with what you were speaking to, the head, hearts, hands, I sit with what is the praxis? What are the ways that move us into what Alnoor and I will often call applied ontological shifts? What are ways that get us to do this in a daily way? How do we continue to sharpen, in a way, I would say, the metacognition, this gaze that we are ever sharper by the way that we are perceiving and the way that that's living in our body? And then what is it that we're listening to about how we are doing and how we are being? So I see this transition pathways very much as the inculcation of these values and ways of being and the ongoing praxis that allows us to do that, with finding these coordinates, what ours is to do in these transition pathways. And then what is it that that guides us to continue to find our way.
Could I just want to add one thing, just maybe I take us onto like a mystical turn around race. So for example, in the Sufi cosmology and the ancient Egyptian cosmology, we did not just simply come through, a DNA line because of, evolutionary forces and material exchange of sperm or what have you, right? That the belief was and is that we have star ancestry. Now, I'm not even saying this is true or not true. Maybe we do willing suspension of disbelief for a couple of minutes, that our star ancestors, including us as a complex of being, chose our physical DNA line, chose who our parents would be, chose our time of incarnation to come through in the Kali Yuga in this context, and that we have chosen to incarnate in white bodies or brown bodies or indigenous bodies or black bodies or trans bodies or queer bodies or hetero bodies or what have you. And part of our task is to remember what the spiritual aim and teleology was of choosing these forms, and that we are here partly to do the redemption work of our ancestors and to honor their trauma and their sacrifices. And now, if that's true, let's assume it is just for the purpose of this inquiry, then the question is, well, look, if the world's wealth is our collective endowment, right? None of us made this wealth. Like, rich people think that they are industrious and intelligent, but maybe they're just lucky and greedier than other people. Now, whether true or not, again, we'll suspend disbelief. And so you take a toilet, for example. We just flush the toilet and don't think about it. And that was hundreds of years of labor, huge amounts of water, engineering, technology, the roads that we use, the universities that we go to, all the technology we use are hundreds of thousands of people's, if not millions of people's, if not billions of people's labor, right? Then we include the global extraction supply chain and fossil fuels, and the entanglement just deepens and deepens and deepens. We live in this culture where we believe the small s self has pure agency and is making all these decisions. And what quantum physics is teaching us is that we meet the universe halfway, that wave functions collapse into superpositions of possibility based on our awareness, our consciousness, our interbeing, and our interaction with these things. And so something else is at play, whether we acknowledge it or not. There's co-agency, there is entanglement, there's historical antecedent, there's all of these forces working to bring us into this current moment. And what archetypal role do we want to play? Do we want to be the benevolent philanthropist doling out change? Do we want to be the money hoarder at the end of time? Or do we want to declare to the living universe and the living cosmos and the living planet who we are at every moment through intention, action, consciousness, ontology? That's the moment-to-moment choice we have. We want to talk about embodiment. That is the front line of embodiment.
Well, this is very beautiful. We're in the last minutes here. There's a very pragmatic question from Alicia Whitnick about, is there a link about the work Lynn and Preeta are doing? But I would add to that, is there a link that people can follow to your collective work, both the post-capitalist book, but also where can people who have been magnetically drawn to the beautiful choices both of you are making and have made in your community, and people, I'm not making you exceptional, people all around the world are making these choices, but for those who are drawn to learn more about your work, where can they find that online?
You're going to put in the TRC website. So first of all, I spoke, Preeta, we have part of our work in doing this book and also the gatherings has been having an accompaniment circle. And Preeta has been engaged with us in that way as an accompaniment circle among others who are near and dear to the Commonweal and perhaps the Omega family.
And Orlin, we saw Orlin's name.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So just to honor that. And so I spoke ahead of that. Preeta and I have anything to announce, but we have an intention to find a way where we can work with an organization or it's beyond an organization, I would say a collective service space to develop some of this, to offer it out and offer those who want to engage in post-capitalist realities. And then there's the work that Alnoor and I are doing ongoingly in the Transition Resource Circle. That's this name that we have of this temporary organizational zone. That, as we said, includes some in-person gatherings. Will increasingly, right now we're at the end of a webinar series. We have one more, but all of the webinars are on a YouTube channel. If you type in Transition Resource Circle, you can see previous webinars where we've had incredible guests be with us who have been speaking to different inquiries that we go into in the book and offering their wisdom. So you can engage with us in that way. And I feel very much kinship and been part of this within the Omega community. And so I look forward to, as we continue these conversations that happen, that we're all invited to be, that we can find our ways with how we're doing what and how are we grappling with the shift of ontological gaze, the inner work that's required for the outer systemic work that we're showing up for and responding to. So
you mentioned service space, which is such a beautiful community that Preeta is so involved with Nipun Mehta and my colleague Cynthia Lee and many others. A very beautiful contribution. Well, Lynn Murphy, Alnoor, Ladha, we can't thank you enough. For those so inclined, I'm going to hold this up. Post Capitalist Philanthropy is certainly the most interesting book on philanthropy that's come out in living memory. And even for those of you in philanthropy, you may need to put a brown paper bag around it or something, or hide it in your desk, or be very careful who you share it with. But it is a revolutionary book, and the depth of the teaching, not only in this webinar today, but also in your embodied lives and the embodied choices that you've made, are inspirational. So we're so grateful to be with you.
I'm grateful to be with you. And maybe just one asterisk, which is the book proceeds do not go to Lynn and I. 50% goes to Daraja Press, who's our publisher, who's a Pan-African not-for-profit that does beautiful work and publishes some of the most radical publications that won't be published elsewhere. They do everything Creative Commons. The book is available as free PDF. The other 50% goes into our Solidarity Fund, so activists from the Global South can come to gatherings. This is not Lynn and I's book. These are not our ideas. We have no sense of attribution around any of the ideas of the book. If any of the book resonates with you, the request is that you just see it as aspects of you, reminding yourself what you already know. And if it doesn't resonate with you, then we take full responsibility.
Stanley, back to you.
Wow. Thank you, Alnoor and Lynn. And also thank you to all the people that have supported this work, not just the people that you've spoken with, who have contributed their intellectual, their heart, their life force energy to this work, but who have even come before then, laying the ontological ground and framework that that this builds upon. It is an extraordinary body of work. So thank you so much, and so deeply appreciate this conversation. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined us. We deeply appreciate you being here. A recording will be made available on the omega.ngo website, as well as the New School at Commonweal. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next conversation. Take care.